Hello and welcome back to another tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be starting work on the display case block by creating the block, tile entity, GUI and container. So let's start by creating all the packages that we need. In our parent package we're going to create another new package called .client.gui and click finish. In our common package we're going to create a new package called .container, and in our core package we're going to create a new package called .util. In our util package we're going to create a new class called client event bus subscriber, and in here we're going to add an add mod.event bus subscriber. Then we need to pass in the mod ID, so let's do mod ID is equal to tutorial mod.modId. Then we need to set the bus equal to bus.mod, and then we need to set the value is equal to dist.client. Then we can import bus, and then we can create an @subscribe event, public static void client setup, and we're going to pass in an FML client setup event. And this class is going to be used for binding our GUI to our container, but we can do that later. Next, under init, let's create a new class called container types init. And in here, let's create the deferred registry for our container. So we can go into our tile entity types init and copy all of this. And let's paste it into here. This time, instead of tile entity type, we'll have container type. Let's replace this tile entity type with container types. And instead of tile entities, let's do .containers. Let's import that, and there we go. Now in our block package, let's create a package for our display case block. Right now, I'm going to copy everything in our quarry block and replace the quarry block with the display case block, and make sure that this extends block, and then let's import net.minecraft.block.block. However, we can change the tile entity type to display case tile entity type, which we haven't created yet, but we will in a second. Next, let's override onBlock activated. First of all, we're going to check if the world in is remote, and if it isn't remote, then we can open a GUI. Otherwise, we can just return this, and let's add suppress warning deprecation. Let's get the tile entities. We can do tile entity te is equal to world in .get tile entity at pos. And now we can check if the tile entity is a display case tile entity, so let's do if te instance of display case tile entity, which is a class that we haven't made yet. Then we can do network hooks.open GUI. Then we need to get the server player entity, so we can just cast our player to a server player entity. And then we need our provider, so we can just cast our tile entity to this, and finally we can just pass in the position. So now we need to create our tile entity, but first let's register the block in our block_init class. So let's just copy our quarry, change this to display case, change this to display case, and change this to display case block. Then we can import display case block, and now our block is in the game. So now let's create our tile entity. In our tile entity types init, let's copy the quarry, and instead of quarry tile entity, we can do display case tile entity, and let's also replace the one down here. Instead of block_init.quarry, we can do block_init.display case, and instead of quarry tile entity, we can do display case tile entity type, and instead of register quarry, we can register display case. And now we can create our tile entity class. So under T, let's create a new class called display case tile entity, and this is going to extend lockable tile entity. And now we can add our constructor, and then just super, and then we can also add another constructor where we're going to call the other constructor of tile entity types init dot display case tile entity type dot get. Now if we save this and go to our tile entity type, we can import our display case tile entity, which will fix the error in here. If we go to our display case block, we can also import this, and that'll fix the error there. And now we just have an error here. Actually, let's change the lockable tile entity to a lockable loot tile entity, and then we can add unimplemented methods. Inside of getSizeInventory, we're just going to return 1. And now we need to get a non-null list of item stack called items. So let's create a protected non-null list of items stack called items is equal to non-null list dot with size, and then the size is going to be 1, and we can just fill it with empty item stacks. So we can do item stack dot empty. Now this 1 is the number of slots that we're going to have, and so is this. So actually let's just create a private static int slots and set it to 1, and then we can just use slots in here and slots in there. Now to get items we can just return this dot items. And to set items, we can do this dot items is equal to items in. To get the default name, we're going to return a new translation text component. And in here we put the string. So I'm going to do container dot plus tutorial mod dot mod ID plus, and then we can do dot display case. And that's just so that we can fill out the lang file. Next, in create menu, we're going to return a new display case container, which is a class that we haven't created yet, of ID and player, and this. Then we can override the write function and the read function, which is going to allow to save our item to the world. So first of all, we can do super.write compound to write all the necessary stuff to the compound, and then we're going to check if it hasn't already written to the compound, and if it hasn't, then we can do item stack helper dot save all items, and then we can just pass in the compound and items, and then we can just return our compound. And when we want to read from our thing, we're first going to read all the necessary data, then we're going to do this dot items is equal to non-null list dot with size, and we're going to do get size inventory, and then item stack dot empty, and then we can just load all the items. So we can check if this dot check loot and read MBT, and if it doesn't, then we can do item stack helper dot load all items MBT and this dot item. Now we need to create our display case container. So in our container package we can create a new class called display case container, and then we can go back into our tile entity and import that. Now to fix this error, we're going to make this extend container, and we can import container from the Minecraft one. Then let's add our constructor and add unimplemented methods. Then we're going to create a public final display case tile entity TE and a private final iWorld pos callable, which is going to be can interact with callable. And then we can remove this constructor. Then let's add another constructor, and this is going to take a final int window ID, a final player inventory, and finally a final display case tile entity TE. Then we can super off of container type init dot display case container type dot get, and then window ID. And now let's create our display case container type in container types init. Let's create a public static final registry object of container type of display case container, and this is going to be called display case container type, and let's set it equal to container types dot register, and under the name display case. And now we need a supplier, and then let's create a supplier, and for the supplier we need an iForge container type dot create, and then we need a container factory, which is just display case container new. However, now you can see that we need a new constructor for our display case container type. So let's copy all of this, but instead of that we need a final packet buffer, and let's call it data. Now this should fix our error in our container types init, but instead of this we need to call our other constructor, and to do that we need a method which gets the tile entity from the data that we have here. So let's do a private static display case tile entity get tile entity, and this is going to take our final player inventory and our final packet buffer data. Now for both the player inventory and the data we need to check that they're not nulls. So let's do objects dot require non-null player inventory, and then we need to pass in a message here in case it is a null. So let's just say player inventory cannot be null. Now let's copy this again, and this time do it for our data, and now let's put packet buffer cannot be null. And now we can actually get our tile entity. So let's create a final tile entity called TE, and let's set it equal to player inventory.player.world.get tile entity at data.read block pos. And now we can check if the tile entity is an instance of display case tile entity, which should always be true. Then we can return a display case tile entity of TE. And if it doesn't return that, we can throw a new illegal state exception, which should never happen, and we can just say tile entity is not correct. And now we have our get tile entity, so now we can call it in this constructor. So let's just do this, window ID, player inventory, and then get tile entity, it's player inventory and data. Now we need to fill out this top constructor. And in here we can do this dot te is equal to te, and then this dot can interact with callable is equal to iWorld pos callable dot of, and then we can do te dot get world and te dot get pos. And that should fix the errors. Now we need to create our slots. So first of all, let's create our main player inventory, and this is going to require some very specific numbers to do with our GUI. So let's create our for loop. Let's create int row is equal to 0, and while row is less than 3, we can do row plus plus. And now in here we need to create another for loop. So for int column is equal to 0, column is less than 9, column plus plus. And now we need to do this dot add slot, and let's create a new slot, and then let's just add our player inventory, and let's import net.minecraft.inventory.container.slot, and then let's do column times row times 9 plus 9. Then let's do 8 plus column times 18, then comma 166 minus, then we can open some brackets, 4 minus row, and then after the brackets, times 18 minus 10, and then we can add a semicolon. Then let's add our player hotbar, then we can copy this for loop with the column over here. Then let's do this dot add slot, new slot, player inventory, because this is our slot in our inventory. Then we can just do column, then 8 plus column times by 18, and then 142. And that's our inventory. Those will be the slots for basically any GUI. And then let's add our tile entity, which is just one line. So we can do this dot add slot, new slot. And then we can cast a tile entity to our I inventory. And then we can do 0, 80, 35. And that's it for all of our slots. Then in can interact with, we can return is within usable distance of our callable player in and block init dot displaycase dot get. And finally, in our container, we need to override transfer stack in slot in order to get our slots to work. So first, let's create an item stack called stack, and it's going to be equal to item stack dot empty. Next, let's create a slot, and let's set it to this dot inventory slots dot get index. Let's check if slot doesn't equal null and it has a stack in it, and if it doesn't, then we're just going to return stack. However, if it does, we can create another item stack. Let's just call this stack 1, and let's set it to slot dot get stack, and then we can just set stack to a copy of the original stack 1. Afterwards, we can check if the index is less than 36, and if it is, we can also check that we can't merge item stack 1, and then we need the size of the inventory, which is going to be the slots variable in our display case tile entity. So let's just make that public. There we go, and let's do dot slot, and let's set this dot inventory slots dot size. And if that is true, we're going to return an empty item stack. Otherwise, we're going to check if we can't merge this again, but this time we can do 0 and displaycase.slot. And we need to make sure that the first false here is set to true. And if that is true, then we can also return item stack.empty. Otherwise, we can check if stack1 dot is empty, and if it is, we can do slot dot put stack item stack dot empty. and otherwise we can do slot.onSlotChanged. And that's it for this function and our container. Now we need to create our screen, so let's rename this client.gui that we made earlier to client.screen for better organization. Now in here we can create a new display case screen, and let's make this extend container screen of our display case container, and let's add the constructor. Then we can add unimplemented methods, which is just draw the background layer. And this class won't be used on the server, so we can add an only in annotation of dist.client. Let's import only in, and now we can add our GUI resource. Let's create a private static final. Let's call this display case GUI, and this is going to be a resource location, display case GUI, and it's going to be equal to a new resource location of tutorial mod.modid, and then we can pass in textures /GUI/display case, which is the path that our GUI is going to be in. And then we need to add a .png on the end because this is a PNG file. Then in our constructor we can set this .GUI left to 0, this .GUI top to 0, and we can set this .x size to 175 and this .y size to 201. And those are our dimensions of our texture. Then we can override the render function, and instead of this to do we can do this .render background. Afterwards we can call super.render, and then we can do this .render hovered tooltip. Then we need to draw our GUI container foreground layer, and we're going to do this .font.func243.248b. And this function hasn't been mapped yet, but we can just pass in our matrix stack. Then we can pass in this .playerInventory.getDisplayName. Then we can get the X position of our inventory as a float. So we can do this .playerInventory.titleX, and then do the same thing with the Y. And then for the last variable we can put 4210752. And that is actually it. Now in our background layer we can do render system.color for F, and then we can just pass in 1F in every single value, and then we can add a suppress warnings deprecation. Then we can do this .minecraft.textureManager.bind texture, and then we can pass in our display case GUI. Now that we've done that, we need to calculate where we want to render it, so let's create an int x, and we already have an int x, so let's change this to mouse x and mouse y, which is what it actually is. We can change it to this .width minus this .x size divided by 2, and then we can copy this, change this to int y, and this to height and y size, and then we can do this .blit, the matrix stack, x, y, then 0, 0, this .x size, and this .y size. And that is it for our screen. Now we need to bind our screen in our client event bus subscriber. Screen manager .register factory container types init display case container type .get, and for our screen we do display case screen : new. And finally we need to register our container types init, so let's go to tutorial mod, and under here we can do container types init container types.register bus. And that is actually it. I'm not going to be creating the model in this tutorial, but we are going to fill in the texture. This texture is going to be in the GitHub in the description. So under textures, let's create a new package called .gui. So I already have my texture prepared, and I'm going to drag it into GUI and make sure it's called display_case.png. However, I made two small mistakes. This here was a multiplier, this should just add column and row. And down here I had index is less than 36. I don't know why I put that. This should just be display case style entity.slot. And now if we run the game, we should see a very weird looking block, but if we place this down, we can open it and we can place stuff inside it and take stuff out. In the next episode, we'll be going over a custom block model for this, and after that we'll be creating a tile entity renderer to render the block that's inside of it. However, that's going to do it for this episode. The source code is in the description, and so is my Discord. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.